Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have certainly a lot to cover over the next couple of hours. And again, the topics will change almost every hour on the hour. And I think that's a good thing, because after all, if you just get a steady dose on anything from the pandemic to protests to the issue of racism or even the presidential campaign or a variety of other things, after a while, I know you wear out. I know I do. And so that's one of the reasons why we're going to cover a number of different things. And just to start us off in an entirely different direction, I thought I might at least mention my commentary today, which is entitled Atheists Praise Christianity. And this is another topic that we address on a regular basis here on Point of View. And even more interesting is, after I wrote this commentary, I thought, I've only heard about this book. I ordered it, and I thought, I'm not sure I can get this atheist on the program to talk about how Christianity is so important, but maybe I can spend some time over the next week or so reading through his book and sharing a little bit more. But anyway, if you haven't seen my commentary today, it is, I start off with the question: has Christianity made a positive impact on Western civilization? And I point out that that was a question I posed a few months ago in a commentary. Took the time to look it up. Well, that commentary actually was a few months ago, March 10th. And that was where I asked that question because, of all people, Richard Dawkins, you remember him, he's the so-called new atheist, and one of the most prominent, matter of fact, the most prominent so-called new atheist, had to begrudgingly admit that even though he's an atheist, and even though he doesn't believe there is a God, and even though he doesn't think that Christians are necessarily the best people in the world, he had to also admit that when you remove religion from the public sphere, it's bad for society because it sort of gives people a license to do really bad things. You think? Interestingly enough, he, again, as he always does, to make fun of the idea of God. Boy, I don't want to be with him on Judgment Day. But nevertheless, calls it the divine spy camera in the sky, because he says generally people tend to do the right thing when people are watching them. And one of those things we've talked about is privacy. We've lost a lot of privacy because, there's cameras everywhere. In some respects, that does help occasionally make people do the right things. And so he calls the idea of God the great spy camera theory. He doesn't really believe in God, but nevertheless, that's the case. And then I go on to quote John Rhys Davies, who I feel sorry for because he had this wonderful film on St. Patrick, but that's when we started closing down, and I'm hoping that when we start opening up, as we are, that they might think about another run, because John Rhys Davies, of course, you remember him from Lord of the Rings and a variety of others. He was in Indiana Jones, and yet anyway, he played St. Patrick, and even though... It's funny. Sometimes the best people to play Christians are atheists. I found that over the years. I remember Fred Holmes and Greg Vaughn and I talking about that one time. That some of the guys that they would always have play Christians, and one of the guys that we used to use sometimes at evangelical films, he was a Marxist, but he just played the Christian better than the Christian did. And matter of fact, one of the guys who I knew from Gene Getz's church, who's a Christian, he almost always played the bad guy. So who could figure? But anyway, John Rhys Davies, he also said, we owe Christianity the greatest debt debt of gratitude. And he was, again, even as a skeptic and as an atheist, said he's thankful that Christianity provided this for our generation. Well, anyway, back to my commentary today. Jonathan Van Maren actually talks about a number of these atheists that he refers to as King Agrippa Christians. Now, again, if you haven't read your book of Acts in a while, you might remember when the Apostle Paul gives his testimony and at the end he kind of gives the gospel, and King Agrippa says, well, he was nearly persuaded. Paul, you've nearly persuaded me. And the argument he's making is that many of these atheists seem very persuaded of the truthfulness of Christianity, yet as far as I know, none of them have become Christians. And one of those that I feature in the commentary today is Tom Holland. And he wrote a book called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. I meant to bring it in today. It's as thick as a bookstop. It is huge. It's going to take me a while to work my way through it. But anyway, he's best known as a person that writes about the ancient world. And he makes a very convincing case, interestingly enough, for the power of Christianity to have reshaped the Western world. And so, interestingly enough, he reminds us, for example, that how cruel the ancient world was. And a while back when we did our Millennial Roundtable with Jonathan Teague, we talked about that for some detail, whether it's the Spartans who routinely killed off any, quote, imperfect children, whether it was the Romans that if somebody was sick, they would just be put out on the street, whether there was all sorts of justification for what we would today call infanticide and abortion, all the rest, slaves really treated as property, on and on and on. And so what Professor Tom Holland says is Christianity changed this prevailing view about sex, the prevailing view about marriage, really called for people to control themselves, to put sex within marriage and within monogamy. Christianity, maybe even begrudgingly acknowledges, elevated the status of women. We can talk about all the different rights that we now take for granted that come from Christian ideas. And so, to put it simply, Christianity transformed the world. And if you are interested, we did a booklet a while back, which was based on a very good book on the subject by Dr. Glenn Sunshine, who is a professor in Connecticut. I've had a chance to meet him and actually preached in his church years ago. And he makes the case that basically the Western civilization that we have today is a product of, if you will, kind of the Greco-Roman foundation with the structure of Christianity. So how do you get Western civilization? It's Rome plus Christianity. Then he makes the prediction at the end, when we now get rid of Christianity, what does the Western civilization look like? It looks like Rome. And that's, of course, what we're seeing out in the streets. That's what we're seeing in the legislatures and a variety of other things that he has argued over those many years. And it is striking to me how many individuals who have been trying to criticize our culture have said we've become more like Rome. Matter of fact, there was a good book out by a secular person called Are We Rome? And it's so funny because he wrote the book at the time when George W. Bush was president, kind of arguing just the horrible things of George W. Bush. But by the time I was using the book in my radio programs I do for Probe, it was coming out when Barack Obama was president. I'm sure he didn't like that, but, lots of times people will see a cultural trend and they'll use that to beat over the head an existing president, and then all of a sudden stop wanting to do that when the president that is in office they like. And, of course, I think we have to recognize these cultural trends in many cases transcend even who we elect as president, although we are going to say some things about that when we come back from the break as well. But nevertheless, I just thought maybe to start off on kind of a positive note, Christianity is making some positive impacts and has been making some positive influences when even the atheists have to sometimes begrudgingly admit that, we are better off with religion in general and even better off with Christianity in particular. But we come back from the break. Let's, if we can, get into the first article I've posted. Campus war on free speech spreads to the U.S. newsrooms. We're going to look at what has happened at the New York Times in particular, but it illustrates in a broader sense what's happening in the media, and as we'll see in just a minute, in the culture. So, again, Wednesday edition of Point of View. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Has Christianity made a positive impact on Western civilization? That was a question I posed a few months ago in a commentary and provided a short list of atheists who would agree with that statement. Now there are more atheists coming to that conclusion. Jonathan Van Buren writes about a number of atheists who he calls King Agrippa Christians. After the Apostle Paul gave his testimony in the gospel, the king said he was nearly persuaded. None of the atheists he mentioned have become Christians, but they do acknowledge the important contribution of Christianity to our world. One example is the historian Tom Holland, who often writes about the ancient world. His new book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, makes a convincing case for Christianity. Christian writers who have read the book praise it because it provides examples that various Christian historians have documented. The ancient world was cruel. Spartans, for example, routinely killed off imperfect children. The bodies of slaves were treated like outlets for physical pleasure. Only a few citizens had rights. Holland explains that Christianity changed the prevailing views about sex and marriage. It demanded that men control themselves. It placed sex within marriage and within monogamy, and Christianity elevated the status of women. To put it simply, Christianity transformed the world. Without Christianity, the Western world as we know it would not exist. If the West had not become Christian, Holland writes, no one would have gotten woke. This growing list of atheists who say positive things about Christianity is encouraging. They're willing to admit that Christianity has been a force for good in our world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about what moved from the campus into society. And there is a phrase or a quote that has been attributed to Abraham Lincoln. I sincerely doubt he said it, but I at least want to give at least some credit to the fact that you see it all the times actually linked to him. Whether he said it or not is, of course, another question. But the phrase is, or the question or the quote, depending on how you see it, is the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government in the next. Now, whether that is true, I think we could all agree it is. Whether Abraham Lincoln said it doesn't matter, because I think we see that the things that are taught in the classroom show up in a variety of other ways. And I think we see a perfect example of that in the first article I've posted here by Mark Hemingway, Campus War on Free Speech Spreads to U.S. Newsrooms. Now, to give you some background before I read this, you have to recognize that this is something that, back in the days even when this program was being started by Marlon Maddox, who was the host, we oftentimes said, if we don't change some of the things being said in the classroom, it will show up elsewhere. And so often when we've talked about the bias in journalism, we've pointed out that there is a bias for the way in which journalism classes have been taught. there's now pretty good evidence to suggest that some individuals tend to be more likely to be leftist when they go to a journalism class, but then the actual attempt to convert them is even more significant. And even if some escape with having some kind of common sense, maybe even moderate views, or heaven forbid, some conservative views, they don't find a willing group of individuals to help promote them in the newsroom or other places. Now, we've had just even this week, Robert Knight, who spent, he spent 15 years in journalism, 7 of those at Los Angeles Times. So certainly they're the exceptions. And that's the point. They're the exceptions. But nevertheless, we have for some time also, when we've talked about, for example, the book Coddling of the American Mind, pointed out that what's happened on campus is even more radical than it was even a few decades ago. So, back to the piece that we've posted. And if you'd like to read it in its entirety, I'm going to skip around just a little bit. Mark Hemingway says, 2 weeks ago, if you'd ask what American institution was the most intolerant of dissenting opinion, preoccupied with promoting radical ideology and prone to erupting into disruptive temper tantrums, the answer would be easy. He doesn't answer the question, but I think you know where we're going. That'd be the university. It is rare that conservative speakers are given an equal platform. We have talked on this program how many times. I have booklets that document this in some detail on the hate on campus and all the rest. But anyway, he goes on to say, it's not so clear now the hysteria on college campuses has spread to America's newsroom. So that's, of course, the point he's making. And he said over the weekend, the opinion page editor of the New York Times resigned under pressure, and another opinion editor was reassigned in the newsroom. Their offense was soliciting and publishing an op-ed by the Senator Tom Cotton, who is Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, which talked about the Insurrection Act. By the way, let me just point out that I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm not sure we need the Insurrection Act. I'm not sure that that was such a good idea, but that's not the point. I'm not trying to defend even calling up the Insurrection Act. I am trying to point out that by even allowing a sitting U.S. senator to write about this was enough for individuals to be fired, for various individuals in the newsroom to walk away, and all the rest. And again, Mark Hemingway says the same thing. Whatever you think of the need for the Insurrection Act, which was used during the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles in 1992, the op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton had undeniable news value. But that didn't matter to more than 1,000 employees of the Times who signed a letter objecting to the op-ed. And the argument was running this puts individuals in danger. No, words do not put people in danger. Some words might, but certainly not that one. And nevertheless, then you have, according to the Times media columnist Ben Smith, the Paper's union advised the employees to make their complaint a workplace safety issue. Oh, it just got out of hand very quickly. Then 3 years later, the media columnist published an op-ed by an academic making the suspect argument that some forms of offensive speech are literally forms of violence. So that's where this all comes from. And so basically what you had is a whole-scale rebellion at the New York Times simply because they allowed a senator from Arkansas to at least make the case for the Insurrection Act. And, of course, Mark Hemingway makes the case that giving every employee a veto over what appears on the opinion page is not a recipe for fostering the kind of intellectually robust debates necessary to sustain democracy. The op-ed page has always been a place where I may disagree with your right maybe I should say your arguments on that op-ed, but I will at least support your right to express those. And, of course, not every idea gets expressed on the op-ed page. I mean, I have written op-eds for various newspapers over the years, and I'd have to say more have been rejected than accepted, and I would imagine most people are in that case. But nevertheless, because of this outrage, then you started to get all sorts of attempts to try to explain how this one, quote, even slipped through the cracks. And that's where it got really despicable. I hate to almost use that word, but it's just unbelievable how bad it got. First of all, the argument that Tom Cotton, who is a senator, is fascist for making an argument was pretty strong, given the fact that when people were asked, if the riots get out of hand, do you think we should send troops in? Overwhelming majorities, Republicans, Democrats, moderates, agree with that. But Tom Cotton was, quote, a fascist for doing so. Then the argument was that Senator Tom Cotton was needlessly harsh, but again, they point out there are some other things that have been published in the past that might have really been harsh. One of them was an interesting editorial that apparently was by Donald Trump, which I'd forgotten about, but we'll leave that as it is. Then the op-ed supposedly needed the highest level of scrutiny. You can go to something that was actually posted by Tom Cotton after this fact in the Wall Street Journal, talking about the back and forth and the back and forth and the back and forth. It must have been 3 or 4 times. Then to say that it didn't get the kind of scrutiny that other op-eds get is, again, fallacious and inaccurate. And if nothing else, you have all sorts of other statements being made. So let's pick up where it is in terms of the statements that were made. For example, again, the author of this particular piece by Mark Hemingway said the anti-fascist bona fides of the recent protests are in doubt. The National World War II monument in Washington was defaced in the protest. The mobs in London spray-painted racist over the statue of Winston Churchill. And all the other things. He says, given this context, a staggering number that even began to have some questions about this. For example, you have the journalist Andrew Sullivan. It's hardly a conservative, as a matter of fact, a pretty progressive homosexual. Nevertheless, said it's staggering that a top national public radio reporter equates the heroes of Normandy with 2-bit anarchist thugs. That was his statement there. And then you have all sorts of other comments being made as well. And in some respects, the arguments just continue to be raised about the fact that what we are dealing with here is something that goes beyond the pale. And perhaps the one that I wanted to focus on the last minute or two that I have, the paper actually said that the op-ed by the senator was calling for the use of military force against peaceful protesters. I dare that you go and read the piece. He is obviously talking about the rioters, and it goes back to my piece that I posted yesterday, Don't Excuse the Rioters, in which I point out that there has been this tendency by almost everybody on the left to make to conflate both rioters and peaceful protesters. And I'm going to say it one more time. A protester is a person that's holding a sign. A protester is somebody marching in the street. A rioter is somebody throwing rocks at law enforcement. A rioter is somebody who's beating up bystanders. A rioter is somebody who is stopping cars, throwing paint on it, breaking windows in those cars. A rioter is somebody that actually goes into stores, destroys it, and steals all of the various elements in that store. And again, there has been a lot of misrepresentation, and I feel sorry for Senator Tom Cotton because his piece deserved a hearing, but the New York Times staff revolted against it. We'll be back with more right after this.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we did yesterday is an interview with Dinesh D'Souza, since that was at the 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock hour, and since most of you that listen to this program on radio did not have a chance to hear it, I thought I would just summarize a couple of key points that I found very helpful. I might turn some of those into a commentary in the future, but it is entitled The United States of Socialism. There are 6 chapters, and he has an introduction about socialism, which I'm going to get into just a minute, then talks about really why socialism came to America, how in some respects the vision of Karl Marx has changed dramatically because you never had the working class revolt against the against the bourgeoisie, the proletariat revolting against that. Then he answers some of the questions that people would have. You know, oh, well, forget about Venezuela. Isn't Sweden socialist? No, it really isn't. And so he gets into some of that and then has a very good defense of the moral basis of capitalism and then kind of a battle plan on how to address those issues. So it's a very good book, but I thought for just a minute I'd pick out just a couple of things that I found very interesting. And one of those is you right now run into a lot of young people that say, well, socialism is a good idea, and he points out that we have a couple of great test cases. In the past, people have tried to compare, say, England to China, but that's not fair. We're talking about different cultures, different times, and all the rest. But he says we have 2 very good test cases. One of those is East and West Germany. The other is North and South Korea. Because when you talk about this, you're talking about individuals that are very, very similar. And again, when you talk about, let's talk about East and West Germany. East Germany, of course, was socialist. West Germany was capitalist. And you can see a remarkable difference there. Even the poorest part of West Germany was 2.5 times as wealthy as the richest region in East Germany, and now you can see that the eastern part of Germany gets nearly 15% of its gross domestic product from the western part of Germany. So you can see with East and West Germany certainly a really striking difference, but perhaps the most striking is Korea. And we've done a video which you can find on our website if you'd like to, because here you're talking about 2 societies that have lasted even longer and continue to this day. And you can see this striking difference between North Korea and South Korea. Matter of fact, in our video, we show a picture from the satellite in which North Korea is dark and South Korea is lit up. And that darkness is not just physical darkness. I think it is also economic darkness and even spiritual darkness. And here, again, South Korea is more than 20 times richer than North Korea, a difference that shows up in all sorts of ways. South Koreans are obviously freer than North Koreans. South Koreans are also taller, healthier, and live 12 years longer than North Koreans. And, of course, each year, as he points out, there are thousands of North Koreans that risk their lives trying to escape to South Korea. So you can see, obviously, a striking difference. But then he also shares a little bit of his own experience because growing up in India, India sort of adopted socialism that they had picked up from England. And he says one of the things he just remembers most is having a ration card, which allowed them to get just a small amount of sugar, maybe a little bit of cooking oil, that they were permitted to purchase each month. One of the things he remembers most is there was a 7-year waiting period to get a phone. And so he gives lots of great examples, which you might want to use if you have a young person that says, you know, I think socialism is better than capitalism. Okay, let's just look at some of that as well. One of the arguments that is used to justify socialism and really to justify the vast expansion of the federal government over time has been, first of all, justice, that we, really need to reach out to the poor. And that was the argument used by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression and the justification for the New Deal. But one of the things I thought was so helpful in his book is Dinesh D'Souza said when he was in India, he read John Kenneth Galbraith's book, The Affluent Society. Galbraith makes just the opposite argument. Whereas FDR said we really need to expand the federal government to reach out to the poor, Galbraith said, Just the opposite. We're a very wealthy country, and because we're a wealthy country, we can afford to reach out and expand the government. So it's, as he says, a wonderful argument. Heads I win, tails you lose. If the government is in the situation in which there is poverty, well, then we need to expand the government. If government finds itself in a situation where there's affluence, we need to expand the government. And so I thought it was kind of an interesting little argument he put there. And then he spends some time talking about why, indeed, we are now moving into what he calls identity socialism. And that is, the assumption is that the economic situation would eventually cause people to revolt, and that never really took place. So then he spends some time talking about Herbert Marcuse, we've talked about on this program before, individual that began to say, you know, what we need is not an economic revolution, we need a cultural revolution. So more and more, socialism is all about reaching out to oppose supposed victim groups and to cause them to go out into the streets and revolt. And as I said to him yesterday, even though he wrote this book probably a year ago, long before we first had a pandemic and a lockdown, and long before we had some of the riots and protests in the streets, you can see that to be the case. But just before we end this segment, let me just mention that he does a very good job not only of critiquing socialism, which I think has been done very well by many economists, but he also sets out a very good case for capitalism. Because the appeal oftentimes of socialism is, well, we need justice, and everybody's at the table, everybody should get a slice of the pie, and it's the assumption, first of all, it's a fixed pie. So if I take a little bit more of that pie, then you don't get the rest of that pie. First of all, as we've pointed out before, it's not a fixed pie, it's an expanding pie, but again, if indeed the argument is justice, and that's an argument not necessarily used by Adam Smith or Friedrich Hayek or anybody else, he says, well, no, I want to use the idea of justice because if you think about it, in a capitalist system, everybody gets to vote. What does he mean by that? He says the consumer, like the citizen, is a voter. In this respect, we're all voters in a dual sense. As citizens, we vote once every 2 years, every 4 years for a candidate, but as consumers, we vote every day. A citizen votes with a ballot on which he expresses a preference. A vote costs him nothing except the inconvenience of going into a poll or sending it in. The consumer votes with his dollar bills, which are his hard-earned money, which represents the time, effort he has put into these dollar bills. Only a fraction of citizens eligible to vote actually do, but every consumer votes in the marketplace. Even felons, even children, illegal aliens cannot lawfully vote for political candidates, but they too can vote with their dollars. While citizens participate in a system of representative democracy, their votes are filtered through politicians who represent them. But consumers vote in a system of direct democracy. You can prefer an Audi or a Lexus. You can prefer Fox to MSNBC or the Apple iPhone to the Samsung Galaxy. You don't have to elect some other guy to exercise those preferences. You do it directly by paying for them. And he makes a pretty good case, and that's just, of course, one of many arguments in his chapter on the moral basis of this idea of capitalism. And then in the final chapter, which he talks about kind of the art of war, what we can do, he does remind us, while we're talking about voting, of what he calls a seal in a sea of sharks. He talks about how there are so many individuals in the society who want to come after anybody that wants to do the right thing. And one of the examples he uses is Catherine Engelbrecht, who's been on the program, who was an election watchdog, and as they began to identify all sorts of voter fraud and those kinds of things, the institutions came after her, in particular Barack Obama's administration. First, her personal and business tax returns were investigated. Then the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms conducted their inquiry. Then the FBI came on 6 separate occasions. And so, if nothing else, it reminds us that who you elect as president and the kinds of people he or she would put into office are going to make a real difference as to whether or not, when you try to address something as simple as voter fraud, if indeed you're seen as a threat, they will come after you. And of course, he speaks to that very well as an individual that I think he's always admitted that he did a mistake by trying to help an individual in the election. But the so-called violation of the federal election laws were minor in comparison to some of the other abuses, and his punishment was far beyond what anybody else might have faced. And he does, of course, document that in the book as well. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, I want to get to my second piece here. President sinks amid stumbles over protests. I want to spend just a segment talking about how to lose in a presidential election. It does seem to me that this president may be dedicated to doing that, and we'll explain why right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me just mention at the top of the hour, we're going to be talking with Petr Jasek, and he is the author of this very good book, Imprisoned with ISIS. And first of all, really want to get his perspective because he has worked for years with Voice of the Martyrs, and actually the son of a pastor who was persecuted in communist Czechoslovakia. So he's always had a heart for that. But when he was over in Sudan, he was eventually taken imprisoned, whether they're ISIS members. And I want to talk about, of course, the plight of persecuted Christians, ISIS, and a number of other things. So we'll be talking with him at the top of the hour. But how to win or how to lose a presidential election. And there is all the reason in the world to believe that this is not positive right now for President Donald Trump. If you look at the latest polls, and again, I always issue my disclaimer, the only polls that really matter happen on Election Day. But right now, if you look at this, the support that President Donald Trump has had among what are called white, non-college educated voters has slipped dramatically. And a lot of that has happened first during the pandemic, but mostly during the protests of the last couple of weeks. Now, you've got to understand that he won in some respects with what might be considered a razor-thin margin in the first place. Now, it doesn't look like that when you look at the Electoral College, because even if you win, as he did in Michigan by 10,000 votes, you win all the electoral votes. If you win in Wisconsin by 27,000 votes, you win all of the votes. So it looked maybe a little better in the upper Midwest than it really was. But what has sort of just begun to be a series of tweets and errors has gotten to be kind of at a critical level right now. Perhaps the best piece that you can read is the one I've just posted, in which it points out that the president has compounded his problems with now taking on another conspiracy theory, and that is where he tweeted that this 75-year-old man who was pushed down by the Buffalo police, that was a setup. I just love what Ari Fleischer, who was the press secretary for President George W. Bush. Ari Fleischer is a Republican, maybe not necessarily a great supporter of Donald Trump, but here's what he said. The president's penchant for trafficking in conspiracy theories is, politically speaking, going to ruin him. He says this is reckless. He doesn't know when to stop. Now, let's put this in perspective. Some of you don't look at politics the way the rest of us do. And how have we had sitting presidents in the modern time lose their reelection? We'll go back to one of those in 1980, and that would be Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter had some things he could not control. That would be the economy. You had inflation, you had a misery index, you had all sorts of problems like that. And you also had Americans held hostage, taken hostage in Iran. So, first of all, any president can't control some of the circumstances, but then they can make the circumstances worse by what they say, do, or don't do. And I'll just make it very simple. Jimmy Carter gave this kind of famous speech about Malays in America, which seemed to sort of blame Americans. And then you have this very cheery, optimistic Ronald Reagan coming on the scene. And the contrast between America's in a malaise, we've got an energy crisis, we've got Americans held hostage, and we have somebody else who is optimistic. And, of course, back then, there was something else that sort of worked in Ronald Reagan's favor, and that is back then the Electoral College was a little bit more favorable to Republicans, in not the least of which is Ronald Reagan, being the governor of California, starts out by knowing he would take the state of California, which had the most number of electoral votes of any state, and won convincingly. So, in some respects, there are circumstances outside of your control. There are others that you can control, but you mess up. Let's move to the next sitting president that did not win re-election, and that's in 1992, and that's George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, by then, things are starting to change. Still, in 1988, he won California, but things were starting to move now in a very different direction, and he now is running against Bill Clinton, who now knows he can win some of the South, whereas before Republicans could win a number of states in the Midwest and the South. And, of course, Ronald Reagan could also assume he was going to win California and a few others. Now it's starting to twist the other way. But, again, some things he could not control. One of those is the economy. I don't think the economy was half as bad as the press said it was, but nevertheless, that was perceived. He said, no new taxes, read my lips. Then later he changed his mind on that, and that, again, did not help him. And as a result, of course, one other factor he could not control, and that is Ross Perot ran and took away some of the votes from him. But again, you can see what it took for a sitting president with all the power of incumbency to lose. So you got Jimmy Carter, you got George Bush. How is it that Donald Trump can lose? Well, again, when he had the economy at his back, one of the arguments that could be made is, I made a promise that we would turn around this economy, and he did. I made lots of other promises, and he kept those. And so that looked good, but again, let's face it, the Electoral College really does favor the Democrats and have for many years. And so as a result, can you go back and win some of those white, non-college educated voters that gave you the victory out of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania? And the answer is, well, possibly. But a lot of it has to do with the problem of the tweets that the president puts out and the perception that this president probably is not going to bring the country together. One of the most recent polls conducted found that respondents said they trusted Trump on handling the economy, but a majority said they trusted Joe Biden to be better at bringing the country together. And only 26% thought that Donald Trump could do that. And Joe Biden also got higher marks when respondents were asked which candidate would be better at addressing the concerns of African American communities and Latino communities. So it's possible that some of that can change. It's still a few months before the election, but you have not seen a sitting president with the low approval ratings that this president has since Jimmy Carter. So it's something to think about in terms of how could a sitting president lose an election? Well, we've had a couple of examples in 1980 with Jimmy Carter, in 1992 with George Herbert Walker Bush. And, of course, let's also be honest enough to say that if you just move a few votes, actually, in 2000, and, of course, you have instead not George W. Bush in office, you move just a few votes in Ohio in 2004, and you don't have George W. Bush reelected. John Kerry becomes the president. And so you can begin to see that very quickly when you are talking about relatively close elections, and we've had lots of them. 1976, for example, Jimmy Carter. If you move just a few votes in Ohio and it's amazing how many times Ohio shows up, and Hawaii, Gerald Ford would have been reelected. And, of course, you can move some of these numbers around very carefully and quickly in 2000, 2002, and some others, and 2004 to see that during a time with really close elections, those are certainly very important issues to pay attention to. So, nevertheless, wanted you to see this piece today. It goes into a lot more detail than I have on what has happened to the existing support, the previous support the president has. And, of course, right now we're in the midst of various kinds of protests and a variety of other challenges in terms of the economy because of the lockdown. But it's something that we will be paying attention to because, after all of this is playing itself out during a time where we not only have a presidential election, but senatorial elections, congressional elections, and gubernatorial elections, and state legislative elections, and much, much more. So we'll continue to watch this at Point of View, but when we come back, I want to talk about Imprisoned with ISIS, Faith in the Face of Evil. We'll be back right after these important messages.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. We're going to be talking about a number of things, hearing some incredible stories today that I think are going to give you some encouragement, but also maybe cause you to pray deeply about some of the issues we'll be talking about. And just before we get to some of that, let me just mention that my commentary today is available to you, as it always is, and it's entitled Atheists Praise Christianity. And the reason we brought it up is because even a few months ago in March, I had a commentary in which we talked about how Richard Dawkins and a variety of other individuals who would never think would ever say anything even slightly positive about Christianity, at least sort of begrudgingly admit that religion in general and Christianity in particular maybe keep people from acting so evil. And this particular piece that I've posted today actually comes from a very good article by Jonathan Van Maren, in which he was referring to some of these atheists as King Agrippa Christians. Now, you might remember when the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts gives his testimony before the king, he says, Paul, you've nearly persuaded me. And so some of these atheists aren't necessarily Christians, but they certainly do, at least sometimes begrudgingly, acknowledge the important contribution of Christianity. So in this particular piece, I actually cite one of those individuals, historian Tom Holland, in which he oftentimes writes about the ancient world. It's been kind of creating a little bit of a stir, from what I understand, because as an atheist, he still acknowledges, especially in his new book, Dominion, how the Christian Revolution remade the world, that if nothing else, really Christianity is one of the reasons why we have the Western world. And when we talk about morality, when we talk about human sexuality, we talk about marriage, we talk about how Christianity has elevated the status of women and much, much more. Fascinating book, and I've been hearing about it, so I ordered it, and maybe in the future I'm going to do some more commentaries on it. And so that's one of the pieces we have posted today on the Viewpoint section. A couple of articles I've posted, which we'll talk about maybe later. One of those, a campus war on free speech spreads to the U.S. newsrooms. We've oftentimes said that there's a quote which has been attributed to Abraham Lincoln, which I don't think he said, but it's still true, that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government in the next. And in some respects, the philosophy of closing down free speech on the campuses have now made their way into the newsrooms, and in particular the New York Times. And so this is a very good piece by Mark Hemingway. And then another piece on just how to lose an election, because this one is a piece that has been documenting the tremendous slide that is taking place in the support that President Donald Trump has, especially among, say, white, non-college educated voters and others. And as a result, more and more of these polls are suggesting that if the election were held today, Joe Biden would be the president. So I wanted you to see some of those articles, and we may get to those a little bit later. But I wanted to focus some time and attention today on the plight of persecuted Christians, something we've talked about before with our friends at Voice of the Martyrs and Open Doors. And Petr Jasek has worked with Voice of the Martyrs since 2002. And back in December of 2015, his life really changed dramatically when he had actually gone into Sudan, and actually met with some of the persecuted Christians. He was arrested at the Khartoum, Sudan airport and then imprisoned for 445 days. Might have stayed there forever if it hadn't been for the Czech government basically negotiating his release in February of 2017. And so it's an incredible story, not only about the plight of persecuted Christians, but his own experience being in prison with ISIS terrorists. And the book is published by Salem Books. It's entitled Imprisoned with ISIS, Faith in the Face of Evil. And Petra, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. It's an honor for me to be part of your program tonight.
Let's, if we can, and again tonight, since you're calling from over there, we are maybe indebted to you first because of the experience you had with your father. And so I thought for just a minute before we get into, of course, what is happening in Muslim countries, as I understand, you also had a great understanding for some of this because of what even happened to your family when you were growing up in Czechoslovakia. Can you share that?
Yes, of course. You know, I had this privilege to grow up in a Christian family, and actually in a pastor's family. And my father together with my mother, you know, they both were using not only the official church, but also, they were very active in the underground church, organizing discipleship training courses for young people across the denominations. And, of course, such an activity under communist oppression in communist Czechoslovakia was viewed like activity of an enemy. And that's why they happened to be in the viewfinder of the secret police. And I remember I was a freshly baptized young believer when I was around 15 years old. I was a freshman in the high school, and I came home one day, and I realized that both of my parents were missing. They were not at home. They were arrested, and they were in two different places at the same time, and they were interrogated. And, of course, the secret police wanted to know what was going on in our house, and where my parents were receiving the Christian literature and Bibles. By the way, I got my first Bible. It was also brought secretly by some courageous Christians from Western countries, from the Netherlands, actually, that I received, and I cherished that Bible very much. And I remember that when my father returned home after the interrogation, and he saw me a bit scared, after this open persecution that we somehow expected, but it became reality. He went to his library, and he brought me Richard Wurmbrand's book. Richard Wurmbrand is the founder of the Voice of the Martyrs worldwide. And this book was called In God's Underground. It was written in German language, but I was fluent in German at that time. So he said, read this book. It will encourage your faith. And that actually happened. When I read about how the Lord was faithful and supported and gave strength to Richard to overcome the beatings, torture, brainwashing. He spent nearly 3 years in solitary confinement. I stopped being afraid of persecution. And I realized that the Lord is faithful to those who are faithful to him, and that he will be with us, actually, amidst of persecution. Yes. And actually, this brought even a certain joy into my heart. And so maybe that was even a good preparation, what was supposed to come in my own life many, many years later when I was arrested in the airport in Sudan.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. By the way, of course, we always like to promote Voice of the Martyrs, which is persecution.com. And so we have that information on our website here today. If you even would like to communicate with Petr Jasek, we have a link to his Twitter feed and his Facebook page. And, of course, we have a website as well, to, of course, of the Martyrs. And if you find yourself saying, I'd be kind of interested in the book, we have information about that as well. Of course, you can get that through probably Voice of the Martyrs, but we also, of course, have published it, they have published it through Salem Books, and we have information about that, so you can get it in hardcover or paperback as well. We have a lot more to cover because we are going to talk about this incredible story out of Sudan right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Has Christianity made a positive impact on Western civilization? That was a question I posed a few months ago in a commentary and provided a short list of atheists who would agree with that statement. Now there are more atheists coming to that conclusion. Jonathan Van Buren writes about a number of atheists who he calls King Agrippa Christians. After the Apostle Paul gave his testimony in the gospel, the king said he was nearly persuaded. None of the atheists he mentioned have become Christians, but they do acknowledge the important contribution of Christianity to our world. One example is the historian Tom Holland, who often writes about the ancient world. His new book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, makes a convincing case for Christianity. Christian writers who have read the book praise it because it provides examples that various Christian historians have documented. The ancient world was cruel. Spartans, for example, routinely killed off imperfect children. The bodies of slaves were treated like outlets for physical pleasure. Only a few citizens had rights. Holland explains that Christianity changed the prevailing views about sex and marriage. It demanded that men control themselves. It placed sex within marriage and within monogamy, and Christianity elevated the status of women. To put it simply, Christianity transformed the world. Without Christianity, the Western world as we know it would not exist. If the West had not become Christian, Holland writes, no one would have gotten woke. This growing list of atheists who say positive things about Christianity is encouraging. They're willing to admit that Christianity has been a force for good in our world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Petr Jasek as we talk about his book, Imprisoned with ISIS, Faith in the Face of Evil. Petr, let's, if we can, talk about why you were in Sudan, what you do with the Voice of the Martyrs, because in some respects, those of us that have supported Voice of the Martyrs over the years certainly can pray for persecuted Christians, but there have been real opportunities for you and other staff to go to places where there's a great deal of persecution, to do this in a way that protects them from any kind of persecution, but to bring hope and encouragement and to see what you can possibly do to help them out. So tell us what brought you to Sudan in the first place.
You know, having experienced the persecution under the communist dictatorship in communist Czechoslovakia and having been freed from that communist oppression in 1989 in November, you know, we always felt it as a family and friends as a privilege. You know, once we were served by others and suddenly we were free. And so immediately after the fall of communism, you know, we have established the Voice of the Martyrs in the Czechoslovakia at the time. And we felt so privileged that we could travel to visit persecuted believers, bring some help. You know, you can imagine the joy that I have that when I, for the first time, could bring secreted Bibles to countries like Iran or Algeria. And, you know, I always felt it as an honor and privilege. And, you know, I have been working at that time, you know, as a hospital administrator. In fact, I have worked 20 years in healthcare. But in 2002, I started to work full-time for the Voice of the Martyrs in the United States. So I had this great privilege to meet many courageous Christians, not only those who would only lose, you know, their material things, but also those who have lost their beloved ones. And I was weeping many times with those who weep. And the Lord gave me a special privilege to also meet those who have also, and I consider those people heroes of faith, those who have lost parts of their own bodies because they didn't want to renounce their Christian faith. So I had this privilege to meet Christians in Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa. And in December 2015, I heard, I wanted to visit a young Muslim background believer student who was supposed to be killed in Sudan because of his new faith, and also to visit the sites of churches that were completely demolished,
Yes.
And that brought me in December to Sudan, and I had carefully planned that trip. At that time I was overseeing nearly 300 different projects in 27 African countries, so I could only visit Sudan for 4 days. And, of course, I have visited the country of Sudan many times when it was still one country, but when the persecution stopped because of the Christian faith, stopped in southern Sudan, we focus on northern Sudan. Mm-hmm. And that's why I traveled to Khartoum. And I was able to accomplish everything I wanted. I interviewed this injured student, had serious burns on his face, on his chest and hands, because, the firebomb that was supposed to kill him exploded in his hands. And I was able to document all his injuries so that our doctors who are working for Voice of the Martyrs that could help him. And I also visited the sites of those demolished churches, but it was at night because I was advised not to do it during the day. Mm-hmm. And after 4 days trip, when I was able also to bring some financial help for the medical treatment of this young student, I had this feeling, okay, mission accomplished, and Christmas is approaching. I was looking forward to be with my family for the Christmas time. And I got arrested by secret police right in the moment when I was holding boarding passes for my flights home.
Yes.
And of course, they took my cell phone. I could not notify anyone, my laptop camera, video camera, everything, all the equipment I had. And of course, I missed my flight, and they transferred me to the headquarters of secret police where I was interrogated nearly 24 hours. And after that, they put me in the first prison. And, I went through 4 months interrogation by secret police, and then followed by another 4 months by investigation by prosecutors. And after 4 months, they brought me before the judge. And I heard, the crimes that they were accusing me for, and it was 7 different articles, but 2 of them had actually the highest penalty, the death penalty. And for the first time in my life, I heard that I'm facing a death penalty. And, this somehow brought me to think about, the Peter when he speaks to the risen Lord, and the Lord asked him, 3 times, do you love me? And then he is commanding him to look after his sheep. And then he tells Peter, when you were younger, you just decided where to go, but when you will grow older, someone will lead you to the place that you don't like, and these thoughts came to my mind. But, the Lord has learned me, or I have learned actually the several lessons. The Lord has taught me so many lessons in prison, that I learned a lot from the persecuted church, but when having this privilege also to suffer with persecuted Christians, I have fully understood what I have learned from the believers. Yes. When they told me earlier that they consider persecution as a privilege.
Yes, and we've talked with some of our friends from China, for example, who have talked about that privilege. Just for a moment, some of our listeners might be thinking, well, how could they charge you? And I think there were a couple of things. First of all, you had a second passport, so that gave them the justification. Well, maybe you were engaged in espionage. They wanted to know who you had visited, and then you found out that there was surveillance anyway. So in some respects, this was a setup almost from the beginning, but you can see how they, at least from their rather bizarre point of view, or their really decadent point of view, wanted to put you in prison for the rest of your life because they could charge you with espionage and with, as you said, crimes that could even lead to the death penalty.
Yeah, of course, one of the charges was also that trying to overthrow the regime in Sudan. I had no idea that you can overthrow the regime in 4 days in Sudan, but that's what they were actually accusing me for. And, I have I was probably the first person that visited the country of Sudan, the northern Sudan, after January 2013, when the authorities have expelled almost all Christian NGO workers from Sudan, and they confiscated their property. And of course, I have discussed this trip with the leaders, the expats from Sudan, and they all agreed that I should go. But apparently, I was, because I was the first person after some time, they were just focusing on me. And it is not that difficult, to follow a Westerner in Khartoum. And that's why, they were, and probably the charges were so strict and so severe that they wanted to maybe discourage other Christians to visit the persecuted Christians in Sudan.
Wow. Well, we need to take a break, but just before we do so, let's talk about what people can find when they go to the website, persecution.com, because as a representative of Voice of the Martyrs, we always like to point people to that. There is the Day of the Christian Martyr 2020, which is coming up very soon, and we also have some great material. There's a newsletter and a free magazine, so talk about what people can find when they land on the website, persecution.com.
Of course, they can learn about the most recent persecution of Christians, that could not be published yet in the newsletter. They can also download the application Prayer for Prisoners or Prayer for Persecuted Christians. And that can be on each smartphone downloaded, and people can actually be very effectively helping the Christians through prayer. As we will probably talk about it later, I have learned a lot about the power of prayer. When I was in prison, when I was amidst of the enemies of the gospel among 6 other members of Islamic State, and they were real fighters, highly educated people, young people that could be my sons. And, one of them was a Libyan guy who at the age of 12 was a personal bodyguard of Osama bin Laden. He was highly respected by all the other people, and they used to call him a man of sword. And I thought it was just because he was a bodyguard of Osama, but later on, when he was transferred to another cell, I realized that the title was for something else. He was one of those killers who beheaded the 20 Coptic Egyptian Christian and 1 African Christian on the Libyan shore just a few months before he was sharing the cell with me.
We want to come back and talk a little bit more about that because we certainly remember that vivid image. We do want to talk about the power of prayer. Also, one of the sections in the book's kind of an afterword about, again, the issue of suffering and rejoicing in suffering. So we have a lot more to cover. And so we're going to take a break. And if you would like to know some more about this book, we have information about it on our website. If you'd like to know more about Voice of the Martyrs, we have a link there as well. And you can find all of it at the website, pointofview.net. Petr Jasek with us. We will continue our conversation with him right after these important messages.
"2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, maybe have a question, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us a little bit longer Petr Jasek as we talk about his book, Imprisoned with ISIS, Faith in the Face of Evil. Now, Petr, you were talking about this idea of prayer, and certainly one aspect of that gets to the title of the book. You are imprisoned in a Sudan prison. I'd love to have you talk about what that's like, because it's not exactly a place where they put a chocolate on your pillow at night, and you are dealing with some very difficult circumstances alone. Then, as you just pointed out a minute ago, you're in there with other individuals. While you are obviously a European Christian, you're in with Muslim terrorists in some cases, and yet here you are. I mean, in some respects, that's why the book is so remarkable, because from a human point of view, most people would have thought you wouldn't have lasted even a few days. So help us understand what that experience was like for 445 days in a prison in Sudan.
You know, of course, the most difficult time was the beginning. You know, when I was first time in prison in a foreign country, you know, I was put into the cell with 6 members of Islamic State. And, of course, you know, because of the malnutrition, because the food was not really good and it was not enough, I lost within the first 3 months 55 pounds of my body weight. And then I also suffered with internal bleeding. And through that, you know, for the first months, I have literally lost half of my blood. That was when they brought me to the hospital. And when you lose that much body weight and blood, you know, you actually experience that you become at the bottom of your physical and also emotional sense. And that was exactly my situation. And the first hard lesson that I have learned was that to experience the Lord's strength in my weakness. And that's actually what Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 12:10. When I am weak, then I am strong. And I was amidst of the enemies of the gospel who were slandering me with bad words, beating me, torturing me. And at the same time, they were questioning me because of my faith. And, you know, I was only supposed to answer their questions. I was not supposed to start any conversation. So my first prayers were, Lord, please give me the right words to answer their questions so that I could clearly share the gospel with them. And, you know, and I was able to do that. I was able to share even some testimonies of the bold believers with them. And often they listened to me. I could even pray for them. The Lord gave me such a privilege, not only to share the gospel with my words, but also with my attitudes, which means the Lord Jesus said, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other one to him. I can honestly tell you that this is not my normal nature. You know, I was a fighter when I was as a school kid, but I can tell that it was not me. It was Jesus in me who was able to turn the other cheek to them when they were beating me in my face. And, you know, I could even pray for those people, and I was praying that the Lord would reveal himself to them as the Lord, Savior, and God. But, you know, one thing was really, I was wondering, you know, I was amidst of the noisy cell, you know, after the 9 p.m., the nightlife started in the cell, in the crowded cell, normally designed for one prisoner, but we were 7 people in this cell. And, sometimes they could be noisy till 2 a.m., but every night at 9 p.m., I could fall asleep peacefully, just laying on the simple floor without, at first, the first week without a blanket, and the whole time without a mattress. And I was wondering for several months, why did I have this privilege to fall asleep peacefully? I can guarantee you, if you would not have a proper sleep and being so, exhausted physically and emotionally, you would lose your mind. And that was actually one of my first prayers. I was not afraid or concerned that I would die in this prison. I was rather concerned that I may lose my sound mind. And only 2 months later, I could find out why I had this privilege. My home church started to pray immediately when I did not return from the trip. 3 weeks later, our pastor announced time unlimited fasting chain. We're a small congregation with maybe like 100 members. And there was every day, not only one, sometimes 3 people fasting for me. And on top of that, we have a prayer application in our church. At 8 p.m. every night, people were their cell phones, smartphones started to ring with the reminder, prayers for Peter. And so wherever they were, they agreed that they will stop doing their evening activities and they will for 1 hour go on their knees and pray fervently for me. And now the most important thing is that the time difference between Czech Republic in wintertime and Sudan is 1 hour.
1 hour.
So we're actually, the people were praying from 9 p.m. till 10 p.m. As a result of their faithful prayers, I could fall asleep peacefully. So when I found out about that, I made a commitment that when I will be released from prison, I will continue to encourage believers in free countries to pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters, and especially for those who are in prison, because as Paul says, and this is what we felt later on, these people are ambassadors of the gospel in chains. That's exactly what Paul calls it in Ephesians 6:18-20. But he says also in 2 Timothy, I think it's chapter 2, verse 9, that even though I am bound as a criminal, the word of God is not bound. And that was exactly what happened in the following prison, that we can talk later about that.
Yes. Well, again, when you read through the book of Ephesians, or as you just mentioned a minute ago, or you read through 1st and 2nd Peter, or a variety of other passages like that, or of course Philippians, it's helpful to, in some respects, put that in the modern context, because we do have prisoners and individuals as well. But first of all, I wanted to see what we could do just to answer the question that's probably on most people's minds of how you eventually got out of prison. Then we'll come back and talk about what you found on the ground, how we can pray for those in Sudan, and the privilege of suffering and all the rest. But there are probably a few people right now saying, well, you got stuck there for 445 days. In your book, you talk about how the consulate starts the process, but talk about how you eventually were released with full beard, I might add, and a few other things once you finally were able to walk out of that prison. How did that happen?
I give credit to the Lord, who is the one who, when he opens, no one can close. And of course, there were many people who were faithfully praying. And we, in the book of Proverbs 21, verse 1, we read that the Lord is actually directing the heart of the king like the riverbed of the river in the direction he wants. And the same President Bashir, who described me as a criminal that needed to be punished to the Czech ambassador, after the 445 days, even though I was, after the 6 months long court case, sentenced to life imprisonment in Sudan, he actually pardoned me, in February 2017.
Wow. And,
of course, there were many people, many Christians, even non-Christians, who were signing online petition of another NGO called Citizen Go, based in Spain. They have gathered nearly 500,000 of signatures from all over the world of people that were demanding our release. I think this all world's attention definitely also contributed, but I give credit to the Lord and to the faithful and fervent prayers of many believers. And of course, in Isaiah 55, 8-10, we read that the Lord says, my ways are not like your human ways. My thoughts are not like your human thoughts. As heavens is higher than the earth, so much higher are the Lord's ways and thoughts with us than ours. You know, I have planned 4-day trip, but the Lord has turned it into 445 days. But if you will open the book and read it through, you will realize that He was in control the whole time. He was the one who miraculously prepared me, you know, and showed me, in a dream what was supposed to happen, 2.5 years later. He was the one who, gave me 5 months, without a Bible when I could not have a Bible, and I was deepening my prayer life, and He was strengthening my faith. And after the 5 months, I received a Bible. I was in the second solitary confinement at that time, and I could only read from, during the daylight from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. But after I received the Bible, I read it from Genesis to Revelation, standing at the window within 3 weeks. That's how hungry I was after the Word of God. But that was all part of the preparation that was supposed to come, because after this 3 months solitary confinement with Bible and the Holy Spirit, our court case started, and we had to be transferred to different prison. And that was a huge prison, capacity like 10,000 prisoners probably. And we were put in the cell with 100 other prisoners. But this prison was unique in one sense. They had many mosques because, for the first time in this prison, the prisoners, even the Muslim prisoners, were allowed to go to their mosques.
Oh, wow.
But for the non-Muslim prisoners, they changed one of these cells that was designed for 100 prisoners. They turned it into a small chapel. And for 6 months, me and the other 2 Sudanese pastors that were, at that time we could be together already, we could preach the gospel to absolutely hopeless, forgotten.
Right there in the chapel.
People.
Yeah.
They could find their reconciliation with God through the blood of Jesus.
We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Petr Jasek with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Imprisoned with ISIS, Faith in the Face of Evil. And, you know, we just a minute ago talked about Proverbs 21, where the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he will. And, of course, we see that even in this remarkable story. And it probably brings us back to the need for us, Petr, to really pray for the persecuted church. I've seen some numbers say 1 out of every 7 Christians are in a country that have persecution. I think that number even is low, but as you go to certain parts of the world, and certainly you can think of Sudan, you can think of Ethiopia, you can think of parts of China, you certainly can think of North Korea, Albania, whatever. We have so much persecution taking place. So as we had, Jeff, a few minutes left, talk about the importance of prayer, and then you end the book by talking about the word really about suffering and this idea of rejoicing in suffering. We've mentioned that before, but I thought it would be a good way to close. So share with us a little bit more about the importance of prayer, and as we pray for believers that are suffering, what about this idea of rejoicing in the midst of suffering?
You know, Apostle Paul gave us quite a clear instruction in Ephesians 6:18-20, how he asked the Ephesian Christians to pray for him. You know, in the beginning of the epistle, he's praying for them. Then he is demanding, their prayers. And he is asking that they would pray for him, that whenever he opens his mouth, that he will preach the words of the gospel in a very good way, in a proper way. And I think that's exactly how we should pray for the persecuted Christian, especially for the prisoners. Because in many prisoners, Christian prisoners, when I interview them, they share that with me, that they were trying to use this opportunity to share the gospel, not only with their fellow prisoners, but also with their persecutors. Christianity is the only religion that is teaching its followers to love their enemies. Matthew 5:44, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who are persecuting you. I always encourage people also to pray for the 6 ISIS members who were sharing the cell with me in the first 2 months, so that the Lord would reveal himself to them as a Lord, Savior, and God. Sometimes when I travel around the world, because they were not only from Sudan, they were also from Europe. And when I'm, speaking, sharing my testimony, I'm sometimes wondering whether they will show up at some of my presentations, this is a wonderful opportunity that we have as Christians to pray for our persecuted brothers and sisters. And we should also think and pray for their family members, so that the Lord's peace that is surpassing all human understanding will just guard their minds and hearts in Christ Jesus. And this is a wonderful thing. And I believe when people will pray, of course, we serve the omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient God who could help, his children in a mighty way. But we know that we serve a Lord that is a Lord of fellowship. And he wants us to pray for each other. And he wants to hear from us. And he wants to answer our prayers. But at the same time, I should emphasize that the Lord has not promised to his followers that he will always deliver them from the persecution. In Luke 21, he says, even some of you will be killed. So there is no guarantee that we as Christians will, when we are persecuted, that we will be always delivered. I could stay in prison till the end of my life, or I could be executed, according to the first or the 2 articles. But the Lord promises us his strength. And he also, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, that he will give us the strength when we will need it through the moments of the hardest test or trial of our faith, when we will be persecuted. And we should view the persecution as an essential part of a Christian life. Jesus said, they have hated me, they will hate you. And he gives us the true reason of this hatred. He says that the world hates you because you are not of the world. If you are of this world, the world would love you. And he says that the world hated me because they don't know the one who sent me. So whenever you hear about persecution, and it can be in Korea, China, it can be in Muslim countries, you can be absolutely sure that those people have no clue who God is and what he does. But we have this wonderful tool as Christians to pray for each other, and when we will be praying, I believe that the Lord, the Holy Spirit, will show us how else we can practically help those suffering Christians. And we should never view the persecution as something strange for Christians. We should rather view it as a normal thing. The sad thing is that today we often hear that if you become a believer in Jesus, you should be healthy, wealthy, happy, and whatever you ask for, you should receive right now. That's not the gospel that we find in the Bible. We find that and this is what Paul says in 2 Timothy 3:12, that everyone who wants to live godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And that's something that, I was teaching others and encouraging, them with these words. So how could I be surprised when persecution happened in my own life in Sudan?
Very good. Let me just mention some of the resources, because we've talked about persecution, but of course martyrdom is part of that. And this month, June 29th, is off, at least according to church tradition, when it is assumed that the Apostle Paul was martyred. And I know that if you go to persecution.com, there is a real opportunity to focus on some of that. And so there are some resources that I wanted to identify to some of the pastors that are listening right now. So let me encourage you to consider maybe getting a copy of this book, Imprisoned ISIS, Faith in the Face of Evil, or so many of the other great resources at Voice of the Martyrs. There is a free magazine, which if you're not receiving, it's very easy to get. And then, of course, as I've wanted to at least identify that in less than 2 weeks, we have an opportunity for many of you in your churches to talk about the martyrs in the past, not only the early Christian martyrs, but martyrs even in our day. And so some of that material is available there. And Petr, if people wanted to contact you, we, of course, have a link to persecution.com. We also have a Twitter post and a Facebook page, which will take them to Voice of the Martyrs. And maybe even if people would want to interact with you or schedule you, that's another way they can contact you as well, right?
Yes, of course. And I will be glad. And I look forward also to the time when all the travel restrictions will disappear and I will be able to go to the United States and to speak in many different places and to encourage believers across America to really be part of the faithfully praying believers for our persecuted brothers and sisters, because that's the wonderful tool that we have. And I hope that, I gave a good reason for that, for those people to believe how effective the prayer can be. And they can also read about more of these incidents in my book, how prayers have changed the momentary situation. Like when I was with the ISIS members and they were getting ready to start to torture me with waterboarding, but the Lord has delivered me, like Daniel when he was taken out of a lion's den.
Well, again, you certainly want to schedule him as some of the travel restrictions wind down. So, again, I want you to know about the book. It is published by Salem Books, and if you find it in the bookstore, great. If not, we've made it easier for you to get it in hardback and also in Kindle. Petr, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure. God bless you all.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about this great story from Iona Rossely, and it's Racing on Empty, and we'll get into that. And, of course, we have all sorts of other topics we will be addressing all through the week, but I thought, if nothing else, this would be just a reminder of the fact that there are persecuted Christians around the world, and some who go to even minister to persecuted Christians that all of a sudden find themselves in prison. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to be talking about really something that I think might be helpful, especially if you're trying to reach out to a young person that maybe really enjoys kind of adrenaline racing or really kind of pursuing the fast-paced lifestyle and then maybe has no interest in spiritual things. I think you're going to really see how this book and this conversation will be helpful in that regard. But let me just mention real quickly that our Viewpoints commentary today is entitled Atheists Praise Christianity, and it is really kind of a sequel, if you will, to something I wrote back in March, in which we had some very prominent atheists at the time sometimes admit, admittedly, maybe begrudgingly, that Christianity could be a very positive influence in society. This one today is really based in large part on one article that appeared, and you can read that in its entirety, and I focus on just one individual in that article, and that is a historian, Tom Holland, who actually has been writing about ancient world and then has this new book, Dominion, and I was so fascinated by the book, I decided to get it, and maybe we'll use that in the future. But even though he's an atheist, he still admits that Christianity has had such a positive impact on Western civilization, and some of his arguments have been criticized by his fellow atheists, but I think he makes a very good and compelling case for the fact that the cruel world of the ancient world was modified and changed dramatically by Christian values. The whole idea, for example, of elevating the status of women, of having an idea of marriage being monogamous, of doing to others as you would have them do, and all sorts of other ideas that come out of Christianity really gave us the Western world. So anyway, I thought you might want to read this piece, and you can even go back and do a search to some of the others in which we find it's fascinating. A number of atheists, though they don't believe in God still, nevertheless will say it's got to be at least part of our honest evaluation of history that religion in general and Christianity in particular have been very positive in the world. And then I posted a couple of articles, one by Mark Hemingway, which is a very good piece. Campus war on free speech spreads to the U.S. newsrooms. It has been sometimes said that Abraham Lincoln said this. I doubt he did, but whoever said it or whoever made it up, it's probably accurate, that the philosophy of the classroom in one generation becomes the philosophy of the government in the next, or in this case, the philosophy of the classroom in one generation has become the philosophy of the newsroom, especially the New York Times newsroom, and it gives some really good documentation there. And then, since we are in the midst of a presidential campaign, as well as a senatorial campaign and much more, we have a piece there, The President Sinks and Amid Stumbles Over Protests. So we'll get into some of those protests and some of those conversations as well. You know, we've been all over the world today because we just spent some time talking with Petr Jasek, and you heard him say good evening. That's because over in Czechoslovakia, it's already evening. We're now going to go to Iona Rossely, and she's in Australia, and she said good morning because, indeed, that's what it is there as well. And we're going to be talking about this book, Racing on Empty. She really excelled in kind of this adrenaline-fueled world of speed skiing. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But then later decided to get involved in horse racing of sorts, and we'll talk about what that involved, and then acted as the Formula One PR representative, and also have produced various videos and the like, and is now a lay minister in the Anglican Church Church in Australia, also an artist, a speaker, an animal lover. And Iona, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you, Kirby. It's morning here. It's just gone 5 o'clock, so I'm curled up in bed with my two big dogs at the bottom of the bed and a cup of coffee.
Well, and it is so funny because even in our program, since we broadcast, of course, in North America, I'll have some people in Georgia saying, why did that person just call in and say, well, good morning? Because I said, well, they're calling from Alaska, and it is a morning in Alaska. Or people in Alaska say, why are the people in South Carolina talking about afternoon? We're still eating breakfast here. So you can see that we faced a little of that in North America, but it has been kind of interesting. There's like 5 in the morning there. And if nothing else, I would love to have you kind of tell your story. It is the most involved story because on the one hand, you are a incredible skier, and then we seem like about every page where I have a picture of you, I have at least a broken arm or broken leg, something like that. So, but kind of give us your story here. I almost need to have you tell the life story here for a few minutes, and then we'll get into some specific questions. But talk about how you ended up as a speed skier.
Well, that's a big story in itself because I was a ski instructor, and my whole identity was sports. So I was into skiing, horse riding, windsurfing, water skiing, and I was chief ski instructor in a resort in France called Les Arcs 2000, and they had a kilomètre lancé, which means the flying kilometre. And I used to watch these guys, professional skiers, go down thinking they were absolutely nuts because I couldn't understand why anyone would want to go down in a straight line at 200 kilometers an hour. And we saw some fairly horrendous falls. But then within 4 or 5 months of being in this resort, the ski instructors who worked for me all decided they would really like to have a go at speed skiing. And I was like, I don't think this is a really good idea. But because I was chief ski instructor, I could not wimp out. And I thought, okay, we'll try it. We were allowed halfway up the track, obviously, because otherwise it gets quite dangerous. So we organised to meet on Friday, which is our day off, at 10 o'clock at the top of the slope. So I get there, and there's no one else there bar me and a marshal with a walkie-talkie. And I realised I'd actually been set up. And I was like, I don't believe this. So you look down this track, and it's frightening. I'm thinking, this is crazy. And I said to the marshal in French, how can I get down? And he said, well, you either ski or you walk down the side. And I knew all my friends were at the bottom laughing. And I thought, no, I have to do this. So I did it. I'll tell you, I wasn't happy to start with. Turned my skis around. The skis are 2.4 meters long, and had my aerodynamic helmet that I'd borrowed. And off I went, and within seconds, I was traveling faster than I've ever traveled before on a pair of skis. And by the time I got to the bottom, well, I don't think I breathed on the way down, but by the time I got to the bottom, I was like, wow, that was amazing. And took my helmet off. Took me a couple of minutes before I could speak. And then I just said to my friends, who were all laughing and jumping up and down, who's next? And they all looked at me like there's no way on this planet they were going to go. And I said, well, I'm going up again. And it actually all started from a prank. So,
Frank.
Yeah.
Yep. Let's take a break, and then when I come back, I'm going to get into that in more detail. And for those of you that aren't good with the metric system, 200 kilometers an hour is about 120 miles per hour on skis. You can't even imagine what that must be like. Even those of you, unfortunately, I've got a few people around here that have driven 120 miles an hour in a car, but they've never done that in skis. So we're going to take a break. And Iona Rossely with us. We're only just getting started because not only the flying kilometer, but we're going to talk about crashing and burning and all the crashes that she's been through, and then the horses, and we've just got a lot of stories that I think you'll enjoy. And then we're going to say, all that adrenaline, did that fill up a hole, or did you need Jesus Christ? We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Has Christianity made a positive impact on Western civilization? That was a question I posed a few months ago in a commentary and provided a short list of atheists who would agree with that statement. Now there are more atheists coming to that conclusion. Jonathan Van Buren writes about a number of atheists who he calls King Agrippa Christians. After the Apostle Paul gave his testimony in the gospel, the king said he was nearly persuaded. None of the atheists he mentioned have become Christians, but they do acknowledge the important contribution of Christianity to our world. One example is the historian Tom Holland, who often writes about the ancient world. His new book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World, makes a convincing case for Christianity. Christian writers who have read the book praise it because it provides examples that various Christian historians have documented. The ancient world was cruel. Spartans, for example, routinely killed off imperfect children. The bodies of slaves were treated like outlets for physical pleasure. Only a few citizens had rights. Holland explains that Christianity changed the prevailing views about sex and marriage. It demanded that men control themselves. It placed sex within marriage and within monogamy. And Christianity elevated the status of women. To put it simply, Christianity transformed the world. Without Christianity, the Western world as we know it would not exist. If the West had not become Christian, Holland writes, no one would have gotten woke. This growing list of atheists who say positive things about Christianity is encouraging. They're willing to admit that Christianity has been a force for good in our world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, once again, talking with Iona Rossely about the book Racing on Empty. And in case you are interested in getting a copy of the book, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore. But the easiest way is just simply order it online. We have a link there where you can get it in paperback. I think it's eventually going to be available in Kindle and some other formats as well. So it would be something that I suggest might be something you might think about. You know as well as I do that you probably have a child or a grandchild, a niece or a nephew, somebody. They're kind of these adrenaline junkies, and they love sports and they just go for it full tilt. And this would, I think, be very attractive to them in terms of seeing somebody that has been very successful in the sport world, but then also just, be able to recognize that in some respects there's some Christian perspective to that as well. Iona, first of all, we had you slide down once, 1 kilometer, but eventually you decided that I'm going to do it more than once. So tell us the rest of that story, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, I've always been very, very competitive since I was in convent school.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really I found my identity through my sports. When I was about 11, I was extremely shy. And when I went to the boarding school, which is hard, it was 300 girls, and they can be quite cruel. So I've found through netball and hockey and horse riding and skiing on an artificial ski slope that I was good at sport. So I've always had this link in with sporting, just to, it made me feel confident. It made me feel like I was somebody. So when the speed skiing came along, I think I was actually searching to find something. You're always searching, and for me it was always around competing. So after that first run, second run, then I just became with speed skiing. And I managed to get sponsored by Smirnoff vodka and Alfa Romeo cars. No, I didn't drink and drive. But they were my two sponsors, which allowed me to travel around and do all the big races. So my first big race, I won 1986 overseas British Ladies Champion. And I think the same year I won in New Zealand in 1986. And it was a fairly short career in speed skiing. It's quite a dangerous sport. It was done as an Olympic demonstration sport, but because of the accidents and deaths, then it was actually, just didn't go through to the Olympics. But it's just for me, it was amazing. It's a bit like jumping out of a block of flats. Not that I tell people to do that, but it's that kind of momentum. It's a bit like free falling from a plane, I suppose. It's a huge adrenaline rush, and it's still scary, but it's just an amazing achievement for me then of getting over that fear and coming out the other side.
Let's talk about your crash, because, here you are flying down, and then suddenly your right ski came off, and without thinking, you put your right heel down, and at 100 kilometers an hour, which is in round numbers about 60 miles an hour, you go, that was the wrong move, wasn't it?
It was the wrong move. I was really not obviously no one would expect that to happen. The ski just came off on its own, and it just really threw me, as in, what? So as I put my heel down, then you just exploded into like a human catapult, I suppose. But everything slowed down, which is an amazing thing to say. I felt like I was in a tumble dryer, but on the go slow. And even though I passed through the speed trap on my bottom at 160 kilometers an hour, so it's 100 miles per hour.
Yeah.
And on the way down, I just really felt, that's it, I'm dead, I'm finished, because I knew the last couple of guys who'd fallen there had not made it.
Yes.
And the other thing I thought was my dog. I said, who's going to look after my dog as you're going down? But the surreal thing was that I actually felt the hand of God over this, even though I didn't know who God was. I just had this amazing sense of peace, even though I was scared, if that makes sense.
Of course.
And when I finally stopped, I remember vaguely sitting up and thinking, wow, I can breathe, I'm alive. And I looked down at my right leg, and I realized there wasn't much left of it, and then I just passed out. And then it was an 8-hour operation of putting my leg back together again. So.
Yeah, as people said, you didn't break your leg, you just shattered it into 9 pieces and have a titanium plate and 23 screws. So that can kind of end your skiing career, can't it?
Slightly. Well, the doctors were very, it's probably the best place in the world to break a leg, I suppose. It's Albertville Hospital is amazing with their orthopedic surgeons, but they did say, I think it was the second day, it took me a while to come around, obviously, but they did say that I would never be able to do sports again. And I would always limp, and I just have to, do my best and be ready and prepared for lots of operations. And, to be honest, if you'd asked me the day before what would have been the worst thing ever to happen to me, it would have been this.
Yeah.
Because it took away everything I could do. It wasn't just the skiing. I was also competing in windsurfing. I was a water skiing instructor. I was horse riding. It was my hobby. All I did was my sports was me. So it was like you were without you. It's like everything had been taken away and your identity. But I did have the most amazing sense of peace. I should have been angry, but I wasn't angry.
And so, again, in some respects, you started saying, well, you say I'm not going to compete in sports. Well, I'm still going to do some sports. So talk about that next step, because that's kind of an intriguing one as well. And by the way, I might just mention, as people get this book, they'll not only be able to read the story, but you just got a lot of color photos. And that obviously costs a little bit for the publisher, but fascinating to see how you move from skiing to horse riding. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, that was, I went to stay with my father in Cyprus to recover, which is a year and a half, and I got back into riding then, which I shouldn't have, against the doctor's orders. And then I met Jesus briefly there, but then when I realized that I could compete in sports, I jumped on a plane, flew back to England, bought myself a racehorse, as you do, realized I couldn't become a jockey because I couldn't ride so short, but that's set me on a roll with horses. I went into show jumping, did a little bit with the Irish team, working with Jack Doyle, who was in Ireland. And then I started playing polo. We're in Dubai now, in the Middle East, working with Rothmans, Williams-Rano. And I actually was invited to compete in a ladies' endurance race on a polo pony. And it was just a short race, 45 kilometers, and I did well on that. And that set me up for competing in bigger races, 120 kilometers, 160 kilometer races. And I ended up on the Irish team for, about 8-9 years. So I competed all over the world in the international races, like the World Equestrian Games, the Europeans, the World Championships. And yeah, I never needed another, I had 3 or 4 operations on my leg. But there was this drive and this obsession to want to carry on competing, because I didn't know anything else, and I couldn't, even though I probably knew that I knew there was more, and I was trying to seek it, but I couldn't let go of my drive and obsession with sports. So.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. By the way, if you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, 1-800-351-1212. But you all know that you probably have somebody in your life, it may be you, but somebody that's very competitive. Maybe they're really into sports. They really don't have time for, all this Christian stuff and things like that. And I think this is just a fascinating book that might be something you can put in their hands and encourage them to read this, because already we have talked about, I think, about half a dozen different sports that Iona was competing in, and we're going to continue the story as well. But if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, just fascinating read, and it is amazing. After a while, some of us may think we're competitive, and then we hear this story and go, no, I guess not. This woman is made of something else. So we're going to take a break. She's joining us today from Australia. Our first hour calls from Czechoslovakia. We're just trying to go all over the world, and we will come back with more right after this.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Iona Rossely, and the book is entitled Racing on Empty. And I thought, Iona, we might as well talk about that because I love the empty part. You talk about when you went off to boarding school, there was a sadness there. You just a minute ago mentioned that, Jesus was sort of there, and then, I can compete again. So there was always this emphasis in your life about competition and a desire to, really succeed. But in some respects, there was, if I can kind of read between the lines in your book, an emptiness that you finally had to come to grips with. Fair?
Yes, yeah. It's weird because when you actually put so much of yourself into competing, so when you do well, you expect to feel complete and different and, on a high, if that's the right word. And I'd wake up the next morning after winning a race, whatever race that would be, skiing or horse riding or whatever, and I'd actually feel not depressed, but quite sort of disappointed that I didn't feel different. And it was almost like, well, I've just spent 2 years preparing for that race. Why don't I feel different? Why don't I feel complete? So I think it's just that success is very fleeting. And, 1 minute you're there, you're on the podium, the next minute somebody else is on it. And then I think you begin to realize that you put everything you have into getting there, and it doesn't actually give you what you were hoping it would give you. So it was just like this ongoing search for meaning. And I was going down lots of different lines from everything. From transcendental meditation, tarot cards, Reiki, crystals, because I knew there must have been something else out there. It can't have just been, living and dying and competing. That's the way I looked at things.
Yes.
So I'm fairly driven on that, trying to find the reason behind life.
Well, one of the things I loved about it in your book, there's a place where you simply said, as you were dealing with this is from the Dubai Equestrian Center, but again, the sun was coming up and the birds were singing. I should be happy, I thought, but I'm not. I had everything. High-powered job, beautiful home, horses, and a husband. Well, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So why do I feel so empty inside? And that's really kind of the theme of your book, Racing on Empty. And this is why I think this might be the kind of book that you could give to somebody that's very competitive, maybe sports oriented, and is convinced that if I can just get to that podium, if I can just get that gold medal, if I can just be we're number one, I'm going to feel much better about myself. And yet we've done interviews in the past where we've heard individuals say, once you get to the pinnacle, you realize how empty it was all the time you were trying to get there.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's actually, I think the world tells you that's what you should aim for. And at the end of the day, when you do get there, you're very disheartened because it's not what you're expecting. But it's not that God doesn't want you to do sports. It's far from it. He's got amazing athletes all over the world. It's putting him first, and then it all makes sense.
But again, some of the question you were having is, what is God's plan? Because there's a part in your book where you talk about, God has a plan, and you're going, well, okay. At the same time, how could God let this happen? So talk about some of the pain that you had to endure even there in terms of your own, relational life and things of that nature.
You mean with him or with...
Yes, and again, both horizontally and vertically, I guess we could say. Relationship with God and also with some of the individuals in your life. Go ahead.
Yeah, I suppose the other way of searching was through love, and I thought, well, you find the right man, you'd be happy.
There you go.
And that doesn't really fall into place because the love that you're seeking is a divine, heavenly love. And, we're all human. We all have baggage, and we carry things with us. So, the love that we have for our husband or boyfriend is very different from the love that we really need in our hearts. And that took, blimey, I was a real party animal. I went out every night trying to search for finding the perfect man, and they don't exist. But I have to admit, my husband, 99.9% love him dearly. But yes, so I realized after a long, long search that it's not in a relationship with a human being. And it's only when Jesus, so many times he tried to step in, and he never let go of me, step in and show me the right way. And I kept walking away, and I wanted to get back on the roller coaster of life because I didn't want to let go of my identity, because I thought all Christians were like clones, that you'd be stripped of your personality, where God actually gave you your personality and he adds to it. And I didn't know that then. So my relationship with Jesus turned inside out in 1 second, in one day, when I realized I just had to let go. And that was when I thought I was a Christian. I'd say for 2-3 years. I read the Bible, I prayed, communion, I did, I felt like I walked with Jesus. And then I was always praying for a deeper relationship. And he'd stepped in and took away what was most important to me in my life, which was my horse racing. And it was then I realized that I had priorities all wrong. He didn't want me to stop racing, but he just wanted to show me where my priority was in life, and it wasn't him.
And so talk about how that developed, because you then had to decide, church attendance. And as we've already sort of mentioned, that you've had kind of an outreach there as well through the Anglican Church and things of that nature. So how did that begin to manifest itself in terms of now having a Christian walk?
I mean, for me, it was, I was in France when I was racing. So, it was Dubai, then France. So when I had met two amazing Christian couple who lived and breathed Jesus, and they were the ones that I suddenly realized that Jesus was very much alive. And I was just, finally, I thought, this is it. So I went on that walk of knowing that Jesus was there, but I didn't really sort of let go. It was only when I had a horse racing incident where one of my horses couldn't compete in the World Equestrian Games in Kentucky, actually. It was 2010. And I'd always competed for the Irish team. I'd never not qualified. And the day before the race, my horse got sick for no reason. And I totally lost the plot, totally. I got very upset, more than upset. I felt like God had abandoned me. And that's when, I think it was a couple of days later, I just, walking down the stairs into the kitchen, I felt like someone had died in the family. My identity had been stripped. So I felt that God had taken away the opportunity of me racing in America. And I'd never really had failed at not registering or getting onto the team. And I just remember walking down into the kitchen just feeling I failed, like beyond failed. And anyone who's competitive would understand this, that it's just, I took 3 years getting that horse ready, and now I couldn't compete, and now I couldn't represent Ireland. And I remember walking into the kitchen, seeing my Bible on the table, and then realizing that I got it all wrong. And it was as if Jesus had walked into the kitchen, and I felt this overwhelming sense of love where he said, I never, ever left you. You left me. And I was like, yep. And I just dropped on my knees. I cried. There were tears of joy, of sadness. And I had this most amazing sense that suddenly all the baggage that I'd been carrying, and chains that seemed to chain my ankles and my feet, all the stuff I carried, about my identity was suddenly released, because I just, in my heart, I said, I don't want to carry on the way I've been living. I don't want to be obsessed with competing and winning, and I just wanted to hand everything over. And I think it's that surrendering of everything over to God. Not that he's going to take away your sports or anything, but surrendering everything to him and letting him, that you're following him and not that I'm controlling my life. And it was in an instant, in the twinkle of an eye, my whole life changed from that one second.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back and talk about the future for Iona Rossely. And the book is entitled Racing on Empty, and you have information about it on our website. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Again, the book is entitled Racing on Empty. Iona Rossely with us. And I might just mention we have a link to her website, ionarossely.com. Burnout, tired, exhausted, wherever or however you word it, sometimes having everything you dreamed of still can't fill the void. Find out how she overcame emptiness to a life filled with hope, joy, and purpose. And I thought for just a few minutes, Iona, we might talk about how people can use this book, how they can benefit from the website that we have linked there for you, because this, as I said before, is obviously your story, but it certainly would resonate, I would think, from and certainly for a lot of individuals who are very competitive, who have been seeking success, whether it's in the sport world or whether it's in the business world or whatever it might be. Even right now with this lockdown and the pandemic, a lot of people are going, wait a minute, I can't go out there and practice. I can't go out there and earn a living. I can't go out there and compete. And that's maybe a time in which I think some people are starting to ask good questions. And your book certainly takes the time to challenge whether or not you're trying to climb the ladder of success only to find out the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I think, especially what's happening now in the world, when you realize that you are not in control, is when, for me, I just feel like God's shaking the planet, and He wants people to stop and look up. And a lot of people, their lives have been, things have been taken away from them they can't normally do, and I can totally relate with that because that happened to me so many times. But it's also an opportunity, because when things are taken away from you, you get off that roller coaster of life. And you don't, at the moment, many of us don't have that ticket to get back on. So it's an opportunity, I would say, not to bury your head in the sand, but to ask God, believers and non-believers, why? Why am I here? Why is this happening? And, you know, God answers every single prayer. So the book, it's just very strange that it's appeared. It was supposed to be out a couple of months ago, but it's actually lined up really well. But I see we're just helping so many people across the board, both Christians and non-Christians. For people that are maybe a little bit lost at the moment and feel broken, there's a lot of sporting engagements that can't happen. So people, you know, athletes are like, well, what do I do? Where's my life? Who am I? But you're so much more than what you do. And I think the book just resonates that there is so much more. And I'd say I've been very open. It's warts and all. It's, you know, I wasn't a very well-behaved young child, and I wasn't a very good teenager or young adult. I was a real party animal. I did things I shouldn't have done. But, you know, God worked through me through that. And, you know, wherever you are in life, my feeling is I know that God, in a second, can change all that. It's just, you know, our identity is in who created us, not in what we do. And He doesn't strip us of our personality. He adds to that and puts us on the right track of what we should be doing. So the book, actually, for me, it's for everybody. It's for the Christian who wants a deeper relationship, because at the end of the book we talk about sitting at Jesus' feet and letting Him speak to us, because we're always too busy asking where He wants to be heard as well. We don't always listen. And in every single lifestyle that we have, you know, from CEOs to cleaners to athletes, it's just, we all ask that question, you know, who are we, why are we here? And I think my book is really just saying, you know, don't compare yourself. It's a journey, so it's my journey, but I've learned that being competitive, can't look at anybody else and compare myself. Because, you know, God made us all very unique, and what we do will be very different from someone else. So I think it's for everybody. I pray that they're blessed by the book, knowing that they are truly unique and that God has a plan which is specifically for them. And there is hope, even when the world looks a bit crazy at the moment, that there is hope for everybody.
Might just mention the book just came out today, so that's why we wanted to focus on it. And by going to your website, they can get a copy of the book. Of course, we have a link there as well, but they can use either one. But in the upper right-hand corner, it also says Book Iona, and that is, I know we're kind of locked down right now, so most people are not that interested in getting a speaker. But as that opens up, I think your testimony might be something that even some people here in the United States or people listening, because not only do we broadcast the United States, but people hear this on the internet around the world might want to have you come and speak and share your story and testimony, because if nothing else, a lot of people say, especially young people, just say, oh, I wish I could be the kind of person she was. I wish I could race and do all these kinds of things. And your testimony is, you might actually think that's going to fill the void, but I was all through my life racing on empty. So we have that link to the website, and if people want to contact you, they can do so, can't they?
Yes. And, America is very dear to my heart. My father lived in South Carolina in Aiken. It was actually his birthday today, and the book was dedicated to him. So he passed away 18 months ago. But my stepmom lives in Aiken, and we do a lot of traveling to the States. So would love to come and speak. And I don't have a problem talking. My husband always tells me that. So I do enjoy sharing my testimony and just glorifying God that he can step in and just show people what he can actually do. So I'd be very open to coming to America,
Well, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour. And I know we had to get you up early. Again, it's hard for some of our listeners to imagine that it's 5 now, about 6 o'clock in the morning there. But nevertheless, thank you for joining us. And again, as I said before, if you've got a Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a church, a conference, something like that, you might want to find out more about her book and have her come and speak for you as well. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Thank you so much. And enjoy your day.
We are going to wind it down for today. And let me just mention real quickly that the commentary today, the Viewpoints commentary, is entitled Atheists Praise Christianity. And that might be something else you might use with some of your atheist friends or some of your skeptical friends. And so that one is today, June 10th. March 10th, it turns out they're both on the 10th, was one that I'd done before on the atheist admission. In the one on March 10th, we talked about people like Richard Dawkins, kind of the premier leader in the so-called new atheist movement, or even John Rhys Davies, who, of course, says Davies has been in The Lord of the Rings. He's been in the Indiana Jones films, but he was also portraying St. Patrick in the movie I Am Patrick, which unfortunately didn't do well because we closed down the theaters. I hope they bring it out again. And my commentary today picks up on a couple of other atheists. One in particular, I focus on Tom Holland, who is actually an atheist historian who nevertheless points out that Christianity has been such a blessing and such a positive impact on Western civilization. So a couple of very good commentaries that you might want to take advantage of. And if you don't receive those in your inbox, let me encourage you just to click on the button there, because it, as you read that, says, never miss a viewpoint. Sign up here, and we'd be glad to send my Viewpoint commentaries to you Monday through Friday. Benedexter's commentary will come to you on Saturday, and so that's just one more way you can participate with us. And if you've enjoyed some of the conversation over the last 2 hours, let me encourage you maybe to click on that button that says donate and support this ministry, because we are dependent upon your gifts as we come to the end of our fiscal year, June 30th. We certainly need to hear from you if you can help us out. That's all we have for today. Certainly want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. I hope you'll join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.